Welcome, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about how to make sure that your child is not put in that inclusion box. You know, the one that says, oh, he can be included for lunch and recess and specials. And, when we have a class party, sure, he can come down. No. Today we want to think outside of that inclusion box. And then, yikes, and it's going to fall down on me. Do you hear that tumbling? So we're dismantling the inclusion box. That's what that sound effect was. And instead, we're going to be talking about how to celebrate your child and the gifts that they have and make sure that there's actual valuable content being taught to your child in the general education classroom and that they're learning side by side with their classmates and their friends in that general ed classroom. So if you are new to our show and don't know myself, I'm Charmaine Thaner. I'm a parent, a retired teacher, and advocate, and also an author of a #1 best-selling book, The Art of Advocacy, A Parent's Guide to a Collaborative IEP Process. So, like I said, today we're going to be learning some new tips and strategies because we have a wonderful guest with us, Sue Swenson, who is the president of Inclusion International, and she's also the former acting director of the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services in the Federal Department of Education. So I want to welcome Sue to our show today. Welcome, Sue. And would you like to add anything else to our introduction and tell folks anything else about yourself?
Sure, Charmaine. Thank you so much for the invitation today. It's an important topic, very close to my heart. I'm still president-elect of Inclusion International.
Okay.
I don't actually take office as president until June of 2018. That meeting will be in London. It is something where we encourage people from around the world who are family members and self-advocates and people working in the field to come and work with us on key issues of inclusion. I just want people to know I was also a mother. My son Charlie was included in school from second grade on, with sometimes a lot of difficulty and sometimes a lot of joy. And that experience is what I go on. It's old now. It's Charlie was born in 1980, so the schools that he went to, there are different rules in place now and different ideas in place now. Some of which are better, some of which make it, I think, more difficult to be included. So I eagerly anticipate all conversations with young parents who are doing the work now, and therefore this invitation today is a terrific one. Thanks.
Well, you're welcome. Oops, and let's see. I don't know if that's my phone. Let me see. I'll turn down my volume here. I know we're live and we have a couple guests, so for our viewers, feel free to type in the comments any questions you have, and I'll relay those to Sue, and she'll be able to answer them for us. And if you have friends that you know would love this show, share it now. Just click on the share button. But Sue, I think you've talked a little bit about, where your passion for inclusion came from as far as with your son, Charlie. But then also, I guess, like from, a professional point of view, if you want to give us a little bit of background for how that knowledge has helped you advocate as a parent.
And so a couple of things. I've learned a lot from the international human rights movement. And I just want to put a couple of observations out there to start with. When I was in the U.S. Senate working on IDEA in 1996, and our draft became the 97 law, and then later when I was at ADD in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services in the Clinton administration, and then even later when I was in the U.S. Department of Education in the Obama administration, it seemed to me that what we were really good at is talking about regulations and how we're going to change the regulations. And I don't know how to say this, but my experience was always that regulation is only a broad outline of what's going to happen with our children. And in human rights work, what we learn is that civil rights are only one branch of human rights. And then you also have political rights, economic rights, cultural rights are being developed now. And those are the ones that I think we should be focusing on in the disability community much more than we do. And not to say we shouldn't focus on our civil rights and the ability to litigate when we want to litigate or need to litigate, but I think we need to start thinking instead about cultural rights, by which I mean, how do we want our children to grow up? So if you think of agriculture or any kind of horticulture or any kind of culture, school is an acculturation process for children. And what do we want them to be learning as they grow up? And those are the cultural rights that I would like to see us spend more time on. Being included as a matter of law and regulation has quite a different feel to it than being included as a matter of philosophy and welcome and just cultural belonging, a sense that, you are one of us. We all know the difference between being in a room where they have to take us and being in a room where they want us to be. And I think our children can feel that also. And I think it takes a lot of effort to create that second kind of belonging. And God knows parents don't have a whole bunch of time on their hands. But sometimes what I've found is it was not a matter of doing more. It was a matter of stepping back, doing less, and letting inclusion emerge from the situation. So that puts me at a little bit sideways from a lot of advocates. But I don't mean it to be, oh, we should do this instead of that. I just mean we need to be thinking about both.
Right. And I appreciate that, because I think what it is it gives us, another perspective of looking at children and how, like you said, that culture viewpoint of how they can grow up together, be friends, and treat each other with kindness. And I think it all comes from when kids are actually together in a classroom and form those relationships, versus being down at the end of the hall and it's like this unknown mystery of what happens in that room.
Right. What's wrong with those kids? Right. What did they do to deserve to be down there?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And so, yeah, and it is a difference between, the IEP team is going to make me take this child and have them in my room for so many minutes a day, versus I'm excited because guess what? I mean, when I was a classroom teacher, it was like when I had kids included in my classroom who had, significant disabilities, it helped me be a better teacher. So, I think we all know good teaching is good teaching. And so if we can welcome kids and learn from each other, that's the kind of life that we want everybody to have after school,
Most of us, besides having a child with a disability, most of us have other children who don't have disabilities. And I always thought the way you can tell the best teacher is they're the ones who have the inclusive classrooms. And those were the same teachers I wanted for my other kids, because they're just better able to individualize and think about different strategies and different ways to educate kids. So that was before we had universal design for learning or some of the MTSS strategies that we have now. But certainly it was my observation that not only I think Charlie's presence called out good teaching, but that it helped me figure out who the good teachers were for my other kids. Charlie, I've told this story sometimes that in second grade, he was finally included in a segregated classroom in the same school that my older son went to. And I walked down the hall to the second grade teacher and said, she had Will, and I said, would you mind if Charlie comes in for 5 minutes of inclusion after lunch? Because I know you do story time after lunch. She said, sure, let him come down, that's fine. He's just right down the hall. We'll arrange for it. And she called me 2 weeks later and said, oh, Sue, I really need a favor. I said, Joan, what is it? And I was so worried, what you would think. And she said, well, the kids don't want him to go back to that little room. They think it's sad. They want him to stay all afternoon. Would that be okay with you? So you're an advocate. I'm an advocate. I said, Joan, is a special favor to you. He can stay with you all afternoon. And then 2 weeks later, she called and said they really wanted him there all day. She told me later it was her best year in teaching. And Charlie has profound disabilities. Charlie did not walk or speak, and he had lots of autistic characteristics, and he would make noise when he was bored. And most of his teachers told me it was their best year in teaching. And I think there's something about kids with even profound disabilities that helps to round out a classroom and helps children see their skills and abilities on a different continuum than they would see them if there weren't a profoundly disabled child around in their life. Otherwise, the continuum looks like it's this wide between those kids who are really not keeping up and those kids who are passing with A's. If you add a profoundly disabled kid, then this kid in the middle doesn't feel so bad anymore. So I think it creates a different culture in the classroom. I started doing inclusion with Charlie because I noticed that he kind of watched what was happening with other kids, and I wanted him to be patterning his behavior after the kids who could get along. Everything, I wanted him to learn to act the way the other kids acted.
Right.
Seems reasonable. And then I wanted him to have a chance to hear what the other kids were hearing. So when they had someone read a poem to them or whatever it was, talk about the Constitution, I wanted him to be in the room and have that chance. And then later in life, what I realized is what he was really learning in an inclusive setting was how to get along with other people. Who could he trust? Who could he not trust? Who could he depend on? How could he tell whether someone was a good person or a nice person or was interested in him or whether they were just playing around? And that was a lifelong skill for him. It was something he needed. He was dependent on other people his entire life. So he really needed to know how to read someone else and tell if they were someone he could trust or not. So I think that drove my inclusive experience along the way.
I bet. And
yeah.
those are the kinds of things that you're not necessarily going to have as an IEP goal, but but certainly that richness is what we want to provide our kids. And there's so much more than just the IEP goals that are going to be accomplished and they're going to be successful with. We do have a question from one of our viewers, and she says, my biggest question is how can I affect system changes in my district as an outsider, as a parent? Is there a playbook for how to get something like SWIFT practices started in the system? Do I start with the special ed PTA, the regular PTA, the school board, the special ed superintendent? So here's someone that obviously knows about good best practices from SWIFT. And yeah, we've got those pilot programs around the country, but what would be a way that people could tap into those best practices and use in their district?
That's just a brilliant question, and someone who obviously already understands the system well enough to know. So I will tell you, this may not be the answer you want to hear, but I worked with the IEP team, I worked with the building team, I worked with the building strategic planning process, I worked with the city special ed advisory committee, I worked with the state special ed advisory committee, I made presentations at the school board in Minneapolis. There is no level at which you can't work. I will give you one piece of advice as a parent. If you're involved in leadership in one organization, don't take on the leadership of another organization, even if it's just a different layer. Find someone to follow behind you, to take that one and move forward so that you can have the new experience, but don't become the usual suspect who's doing everything all at once. Bring other people along. That's really important, I think, to do that for your own mental health as well as for the sake of growing other leaders who are going to be standing next to you in the process. SWIFT, I think, is a brilliant investment that we made through OSEP. And OSEP makes continuously fantastic investments. We don't have very much advocacy for the OSEP research programs, the research to practice. the advocates go out and they're always advocating about IDEA regs for the classroom, but not about funding for our programs. And as you know, we lost a lot of that funding when the Institute for Educational Sciences went into place. So I just want to put that bug in people's ears that if you like these programs like SWIFT, it doesn't hurt to talk to your members of Congress about Part D funding and why it's important. It also funds a lot of the parent SEEK activities and other activities. I guess they don't call it SEEK anymore, special ed, whatever the panel is called.
Right.
So all of those levels are important. I think if you already know that SWIFT is what you want, I would call them. They have a website. You can contact them and just say, I'm really interested in this. They may be able to tell you that there are already some other people in your district who are interested and how you could connect to those folks. They may be able to tell you someone who could come and make a presentation at the school board, for example. There may be lots of ways for them to give you advice about how to get in there and talk about that. As special ed parents, SWIFT is, what do I want to say? It's a little threatening to some of us because really what you're doing is planning for what are the needs of all the children and how do we make sure that inclusion works for Title I kids and English language learners as well as children who have IEPs. And that seems like it would be more difficult, but what it really does is get you out of that little silo that you're working in and start thinking about how do we design the whole system so that it meets all children's needs. And to a great extent, that gives you a chance to really build systems change. Right. I thought I was doing systems change when I was just making things better for my kid. It's not systems change. Yeah. You go through, this. You go through and then the river closes behind you and it's over. And systems change is really hard. So you need friends, you need colleagues, you need to engage in those official committees and ideas that you presented. Go to SWIFT, talk to them. Go to CAST and talk to them about UDL. Go to their website and find out what they've got to say. Go to the Positive Behavior Interventions and Supports website and see what they've got to say about behavioral and TSS. And there's a lot of interesting tools out there. And I'm sue.swenson@gmail.com. If I can help you at all, just send me a note and I'll see what I can figure out.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so if you want to just put in the comment box, if you're watching us live or if you're watching us on the replay, if you want to type in websites, and I'll come back after our live video and I can post some of the links for the websites that Sue talked about. I think that there is so many resources out there, and I think if we can help parents kind of be directed to ones that really are based on research, that helps. And I agree. I think, as much as I think parents need sometimes that conversation with parents, of kids with disabilities, I really strongly encourage folks to join the typical PTA or PTO in your building, because I think when we are in those silos, we are seen as a special interest group versus when we're on the PTO and we plan programs and activities for all kids in the building. But then we also talk about, do we need to make sure we have any accommodations or whatever for other students? But I think, it's like there's more than just kids with disabilities that are marginalized in our schools. So as much as we can use that universal design for learning framework, it's going to help all of the students in our buildings.
Yep, that's really true. And it is true that you need to take care of yourself while you're doing it. Finding friends. I had 3 friends, and I would walk around Lake Harriet in Minneapolis every Saturday together. And we were all parents of kids with disabilities, different ages, different schools. But it was very helpful. It was, you need something to feed your soul. This is culture changing work you're doing. This is really profound work that you're doing. and not something that you should just say, oh, can I win that? I mean, sometimes with my advocacy, I just got lucky. I wanted an elevator so that my son could go to fourth grade, and got turned down in several places, and finally found myself in the room with the superintendent in Minneapolis. And he just called out to his assistant and said, "Didn't you say that you already had funding for 3 elevators?" And all of a sudden he said, "Well, this lady will tell you where they go." And so all of a sudden I was the queen of elevators. And people were like, "How did you do that?" And I said, "I just walked into the room at the right time." And you can get lucky. You can find people who are on your side, who are trying to set things up and do things the right way. They may not always have the right nomenclature for it. This is why, for me, it's a problem when we're now talking about intersectionality. I think we build a distance between ourselves and people who are dealing with problems when we sort of say, oh, there's a code word for this. You know, you're a child in Title I and you're learning English and you have a disability, so that's intersectionality. I don't think we need the distance. I think we need to just put our arms around everybody and have conversations and talk about how are your needs different and how are they the same, and start to build coalitions. I also think it's important to build coalitions with our feet firmly planted in our own ground. So we are talking about disability here, and not just get lost in the shuffle. I think that's interesting in schools now. You know, I don't think we've really yet figured out what has been the long-term impact on American schools of the real estate crisis of the early 2000s, 2008, the collapse of the housing markets. We know schools are funded on property tax bases, and I don't think we really know how has that affected different kinds of schools differentially. We just haven't quite got our arms around that yet. And even as we're trying to, governors through the core curriculum are trying to make sure that all children in all places have good educations, we haven't quite figured out yet how our really strange funding system is impacting that. So I'd rather have a poor school district with people who have children's best interests at heart. I'd rather have that than a school district with a lot of money that's just going to throw money at it. Because I think money sometimes can turn into segregation.
Right. And I found that in Colorado, in the small mountain town that we lived in, sometimes when there's less choices of places to send kids, then it's like, of course, they're a member of Columbine Elementary. They're going to be welcomed here in our building. So there can be advantages to being in smaller districts. And I know even in rural Idaho, we have some schools that are, K through 12, and it's almost like that one schoolhouse kind of belief, and we're all a family and we all belong together. And sometimes when we are in big districts with, dozens of schools in a district, we lose that closeness,
And I'm glad you brought that up, because I think the other reason I was so strong about inclusion is I thought it would be better for my other 2 sons. Charlie was the middle of 3, and I wanted my boys to go to schools where they would see that Charlie wasn't the only guy with a disability in the world, and that people had a broad array of disabilities and abilities and capabilities. And I just wanted them to have that opportunity to build connections with other kids who were siblings or who were disabled kids themselves. And I think that inclusion gives us that, and no other model does. So I know in the old days it was popular. I hope it's not still happening, that parents are being told, oh, you don't want your disabled child to go to school with your non-disabled children because it will be hard for them socially. I hope that's not happening anymore. It used to happen. And I found the opposite to be true. I found the more they were together, the better they liked it. So.
Yeah, we were lucky that we were able to have our neighborhood school be the neighborhood school for all 3 of our kids. And there wasn't, we need to shuffle them off to this other building where we had that kind of class. So, It does make a difference. But I also agree with you as much as we think we're breaking new ground for other parents. I mean, Dylan was the first child included in his building, but I mean, that trail grows over very fast, and
Yes.
it's really frustrating to do it one child at a time because it's not sustainable. And so that's why I think, the efforts like Swift and other programs where they're trying to create more, systemic change is really going to be the direction that we need. So again, just to remind people, if you want to type in the word websites, and I'll come back and give you some of those links. Christina has a question online, and she says, my 11-year-old daughter has issues with math and language arts. She's in 5th grade, has an IEP, but she's had a lot of problems with her teacher yelling, putting her down. This is a self-contained class. I felt I needed to get my daughter out. Had an IEP with child study team that kept telling me my daughter had to be in the class. She's having the hard time with math and language arts. I did have her change class. Now she's included. She's in a 5th grade class. Her level of reading and math is at the 2nd to the 4th grade level. So not a question, but a comment. And I think that's often is, parents get sold kind of, I don't know, this philosophy that, oh, your child is having challenges. If we bring them to this separate room, we have a specially trained teacher with different curriculum. And that kind of makes sense to them. And so they're willing to, look at the professional and say, you must know, you're the one that's, recommending this. So do you have any tips for parents that, hear that kind of pushback from staff?
So this is, again, why you need people you can talk to, and just find some people either online or in your community or other friends. I always thought the self-contained classroom was a place where there are no other children witnesses. So there's stuff that they won't say to a disabled child in front of other children. And people just tend to be kinder when it's a mixed group of kids, in my opinion. And you have natural advocates in that classroom. I mean, you have people who are going to stand up and say, don't talk to her that way, that's not nice. So I think what you've done will turn out to be really good for your daughter down the road. Going into the IEP, so a couple of things. It's an IEP, it's an individualized education plan. One of the things we have to do as parent advocates is get past the I. And we think that's where our strength is because that's where our parental rights are. But our real strength in a school is what the previous questioner asked about systems change and how do we build a system that's designed to be inclusive on the front end. So we just walk in and say, yeah, okay, I'll take one from column A and one from column B and move forward. A couple of key things though, I think there's a flaw in the IEP process. It says it must start with an assessment. And typically the assessment is a load of deficits that you have to sit there and listen to. Your kid can't do this, they can't do that, they can't do the other thing. And I learned to ask for that to be mailed to me ahead of time. And that I would read it in the privacy of my own home, and that we would not need to go over it in the meeting, that we would begin with what could Charlie do, what were his strengths and his abilities. And I frequently would write a little one-page memo. I learned to do this from Marcia Forrest from Montreal. Just what are Charlie's strengths, what are his weaknesses, what are my dreams for him, and what are my worst nightmares for him. And if I started the meeting with that, it seemed to start it on the idea that Charlie was a person and that we were a family who were thinking deeply about his needs. And he would always be in the IEP, which was very helpful to me. They didn't tend to, if they suggested something that he didn't like, he would start flailing around. And I would say, Charlie, what about this don't you like? And it gave me a chance to sort of bring up topics that really needed to be brought up. I think a couple of things. If we start looking at a reauthorization of IDEA, we should think about this piece of assessment and what does it do to a parent to go into a meeting and spend the first 10 or 15 or 20 minutes getting pounded on with what their kid can't do. I think that is a architectural flaw in the process, and one that operates against us as parents. Second, right. I really think, and Charmaine, you know more about this than I do, but I think we have to start challenging the idea that the child with a disability is the only one who needs a contract before he can go to his neighborhood school. The IEP is a contract, and everybody else just goes rolling in the door or walking in the door. Why can't the disabled child also do the same thing? Just show up at the school and say, here's where I'm going to come to school. Now, I realize why we can't do that now, but what would it take to design a system where that would be possible? That's what we should be thinking about. What is the real design of cultural inclusion? What would that look like? So those are a couple of things that I wish we would think about when we think about reauthorizing IDEA, instead of just thinking about how do we put more muscle behind our right to sue, because I don't think that's gotten us very far.
I love this conversation. Oh, I wish we could continue. It's like great because I totally agree with you. I think, I was a person-centered planning facilitator in Colorado, and it's like if we could bring that process, and have that embedded in the IEP meeting instead of this negative, like you said, deficit based. So one of the things that I did that I encourage parents to do is I had heard Judith Snow, luckily, when Dylan was like 3 years old. So that whole sense of this. So right away for his first IEP meeting, which we had at our house, so he could be there. But we had a gift box that we wrapped up, and we had a family meeting, and everybody talked about Dylan's gifts and strengths, and we typed it up and put copies in the gift box. And the very first thing was, I asked if I could speak. I talked about the concept of giftedness and passed the gift box around to everybody, and they took the sheet out, and the tone of the meeting just shifts, and so now, for some parents, it's like just when you go to the meeting, ask everybody to, go around the table and give 2 or 3 strengths of your child. And it's so neat to see, like, the teacher listens to what the speech therapist says, and it's like, oh, yeah, that's true. Yeah. And you see people nodding their heads, and it's like, wow, it's such a more positive way to start a meeting,
I think that's absolutely right. And I think it is within our power as parents to engineer the meeting so that it works like you just suggested. But because we're used to the IEP team saying, well, first we're going to read the assessment, and then we're going to do this, and then we have to instead pull back from that and say, well, here's the way I prefer to do it. And yes, we'll check all the boxes, but no, we're not going to do, I'm not going to sit here and listen to 20 minutes of what he can't do. You can't build on that. You can only build on a strength. You can't build on a weakness.
Well, and I love your idea to just send that home ahead of time. I mean, what I tried to do when I was a special ed teacher was make a list. From the testing I did, I made a list of all the things they could do, and I made sure that I handed that to the parent, at the meeting, because it's like, now you go home and I want you to look at this paper that's a long list of all the things your child can do. Because I think once we start hearing those negative things, we shut down, and it's really hard to be engaged in ongoing conversations after you've listened to that deficit-based, speech. But
it's interesting that you worked with Judith Snow.
Well, I didn't. Go ahead. I didn't actually work with her. I mean, I had seen her speak different times, but she and Norman Kuntz were like, I was lucky that I heard them both speak when my son, before he went to school, and that put us on a whole different path than I think if we hadn't known about that,
It used to be a UAP, but the USET at the University of Minnesota had some presentations on inclusive education, and they brought Norman Kuntz in to speak. And the whole team from Charlie's elementary school decided that they were going to do this as a one-day training, so they all went. And that really brought the inclusion to a whole different level in the school, people understanding it. But Marcia Forrest, who I mentioned before, worked very closely with Judith in Canada and Jack Pierpoint. And Marcia, when I first heard about person-centered planning from her, it was in Partners in Policymaking, and I went up to her later and said, well, where do I find a professional facilitator to help me do this? And she said, oh, that's BS. You can just do it yourself. So she's the one who said, just write down his strengths and his weaknesses and your dreams and your nightmares. And that's what we did, and it worked great. Now, Charlie didn't speak for himself. So if a child does speak for himself, I think you can think of different ways to get across, well, here's what I like and here's what I don't like. And we always encouraged people in the IEP meetings that we were going to look at Charlie and watch Charlie. And when he became agitated, we just didn't treat him like he was being bad. We treated him like he was trying to get a point across. And there was something going on in the meeting that he didn't like, and we better figure out what that was. So I think that helped them sort of model the idea that communication is more than words too, which is very important for some kids.
Oh, exactly. And that's why, even when Dylan was young, we wanted him to be a part of the meeting. So, at first we had him at our house where he could be in the living room playing with the dogs and his toys. Yeah. That the school team could see him. And then when he was at school, it was like, oh, Dylan, I remember your dog and da-da-da. And they had this, conversation, cool. That, this connection. And then for kindergarten, we had it in the kindergarten room. So Dylan could be at the cooking center and at the reading center bopping around. But we could pause and say, and Dylan, who are some of your friends? And he'd tell us. And then it would be like, Dylan, what do you like at school? What don't you like? And even as a kindergartner, there's things that kids can contribute. And he just became that self-advocate because he had always gone to his meetings, and we reminded people, this is the person we're talking about. It's not just to check off boxes, but it's this real kid right here,
That's so critically important. And I think it helps us as parents get past the idea that education is to make our child's disability go away. And I've seen so many parents just fall on their sword for 20 more minutes of occupational therapy or something, some program with a trademark attached to it that they think is going to make a huge difference. And sometimes it does for a short period of time. I've never seen anybody who used to have autism. I just haven't. Yeah, we want our kids to learn the skills that they need to get through life, but there's no program, there's no IEP that is going to take a severely disabled child and make them not have a disability. It's just not going to happen. And I think having your child in the room helps you realize that besides being an educational experience, school is a childhood experience, and it's where our children form their ideas of themselves and begin to have faith in themselves. And if we treat them like a sack of potatoes, you have to go here and do this for 15 minutes, and then you have to go there and do that for 35 minutes. And I think they lose a lot of that capability that other kids have to just develop their own personality and think of themselves as a whole person. And I don't care how disabled you are, you're a whole person. So I think the whole structure that you're talking about, Charmaine, really is right in line with what I think we as moms and dads and brothers and sisters should be thinking about with our kids. By the way, speaking of brothers and sisters, I usually tried to have siblings in the room for the IEP too, and it made a big difference. They cut the crap in ways that I never could. So, it was helpful.
Well, and friends. I mean, I think starting in 5th grade, Dylan would invite some friends.
That's a great idea.
Is doing that transition to middle school, and it's like, so we looked to the friends and said, so when Dylan does this, what helps, what do you guys do? What do you notice that helps? And the students have so many better, many, many more ideas than we ever would as adults that are just natural. And it's just like, and it's like if Dylan's bugging us, we tell him, Dylan, stop,
Right.
so it's like, don't feel sorry for him. Don't go, oh, that poor little kid. It's like, no, tell him to knock it off,
Right.
And
Right.
as a friend, you can do that.
I met Temple Grandin, and I know there's controversy about Temple, but I think she knows a lot. And I asked her when a kid just sits in a room and kind of moans, what is that? And she said, well, sometimes it's that they don't know where they end and the world begins. And I said, that's interesting. So what can you do to support someone who feels that way? She said, firm pressure on the forearm like this is
Huh.
really helpful. And I thought, well, that's worth a try. So I tried it, and it wasn't 100%, but it often had a real calming effect on Charlie. And it wasn't painful pressure, it was just firm pressure. And so in fourth grade, I went to his classroom and taught the kids how to do that. So if he starts kind of making noise in the classroom, you can calm him down by putting your hand on his arm and being gentle and giving him a gentle squeeze. And they loved it. They would jostle over who would get to sit next to him to help him calm down. And what a great skill to have, and what a chance to grow up and be a person who's not going to be afraid if they're with someone sometime who is different. They'll know how to just interact and talk to them and be part of the situation. So I just think that's what inclusion really is about. It's about not only giving opportunities to our disabled child, but giving opportunities to everyone else around him or her to see that they belong, how they belong, what they bring to the classroom. I mean, the kids in Charlie's class would say, it's weird, he starts laughing before something funny happens.
Huh.
And I can't explain that. That was my experience with him too, but kids would notice that. And they thought of it as kind of a superpower. And okay, so that's interesting. And then when they saw him have a seizure, they knew what a seizure looked like and what you should do when that happens. And he never had big seizures, so we were lucky with that. But they saw, and so now I think when they go on in their life, they will probably recognize if they're sitting with someone or in a gym or somewhere else and someone has an epileptic seizure, it should be fine. It should be something that they say, oh, here's what you do. So we are building a world. We're creating a culture where people with disabilities can be naturally part of that culture and not be seen as other, as different, as special, as alien. And we want to build special education that supports that kind of acculturation rather than fighting against it.
Right. And I think I was so lucky because not only did I hear Judith Snow and Norman couldn't speak when Dylan was real little, but Kathy Snow lived in the same little mountain town as I did in Colorado. So when she wrote the book, Disability is Natural, so Kathy was always kind of my touchstone of, what would what would Kathy say? And
Right.
it really helped me when we were going through some kind of tough times with the district, and we were trying to get Dylan to be supported in a community preschool instead of the special ed preschool, and yeah, that concept that it's okay. I mean, we've always had people with disabilities. We will always have people with disabilities in the future. It's part of our society. It's okay. And, that makes such a huge difference when you come from that perspective,
Yep. Kathy's made a huge difference in Partners in Policymaking, and she and I trained in the same year, she in Colorado and I in Minnesota. So I know used to know Kathy quite well. We have one disagreement, and I'm sure you picked up on it already. I say disabled children sometimes, and children with disabilities sometimes. And Kathy's very, very strict about children with disabilities. I think that there are some children who aren't with a disability. They are themselves a disabled person, and I know a lot of disabled adult advocates who insist that their disability is not a piece of luggage that they can set down when they feel like it. It's part of their identity. And so I try to use both approaches and terminologies, but I haven't actually had that conversation with Kathy, so I don't really know. Maybe she's changed her mind about how often we need to be able to say children with disabilities instead of disabled children. I think for some of us, for me anyway, it was really important for me to get to the point where I realized, yeah, Charlie's a disabled guy. He actually preferred the term, according to which one he laughed at the most, he preferred the term person with weirdness. So.
Well, speaking of labels that we can attach to our kids, when Dylan was 3, and I wouldn't let him do an IQ test, even though he had Down syndrome, so they couldn't technically use. At that time, get this. At that time, it was SLIC in Colorado. It was significantly limited intellectual capacity.
Oh, for God's sake!
And I was a SLIC teacher. So I was like, so anyway, they couldn't use that label because we didn't have an IQ test. So they were trying to debate at the first IEP, well, what label, what category can we put him in? So I said, extraordinarily gifted. And so this guy, the school psychologist, looked at me and said, no, Charmaine, that's not one of the federal categories. And I said, I know, but I think that's what his label is. If you want a label besides Dylan, then, and so he did. I mean, he put in the little form, extraordinarily gifted, and I thought, yes.
So this is why Social Security can't use IEPs for the 18-year-old determinations, because our IEPs all say things like, Charlie is a charming young man who gets along with, and it doesn't say anywhere, by the way, he can't walk and he doesn't speak. But anyway, it's important for us as parents. Everybody knows this. It's important for us to see those gifts and recognize the strength of the personality that's in our sons and our daughters. And I would say that's more important than anything else. It's just recognizing what they love, what they care, who they want to be with. Those are all the key things for us to know as parents.
Right. Well, I so appreciate your time today, Sue. I wish you were here in person so I could give you a hug. I love, I don't know, just the insight and the wisdom that you have. And it still makes me look and think in a new way. So I think as an advocate, I really look at civil rights and I really look at that I in the IEP. But you really helped me today to remind myself that it's a larger issue, that it is more cultural, and that there are ways that we can make an impact change on a bigger level than just one child at a time. So I so appreciate you. I love when I'm at conferences and I get to hear you speak, and my husband loves your political viewpoints. And I told Sue when we were talking beforehand, I would like to see if we can have her back on our show maybe this summer, because I think there are political implications and decisions being made in our country that, we know impact our kids. And because of Sue's wealth of experience, from the Senate to the Department of, Education in Washington, D.C., I would like her, so I'm going to encourage her, twist her arm for her to return and switch the topic. It would be my pleasure. And
one brand new resource. Go to Washington Post Opinions yesterday, May 17th, for an article by Allison Wohl, W-O-H-L, talking about the American Health Care Act and its impact on children with disabilities. It's a brilliant resource if you want to look at
good.
Somebody who's really framed the issue in a very clear way as a parent. So that was cool. I would love to come back. I love to talk to other parents, and I no longer have Charlie with me, but he's always here. So this is great. I love to talk to you. And by the way, I'm not sure I'm right about anything, so I'm not clear about wisdom. I do know some good questions, and I think I'd like to think that other people are thinking about those questions also. So thanks for
Well,
today.
I appreciate you. And I'm just going to, here we have another viewer. I'm sorry, I haven't been looking at my phone as much, but Jen says, yes, thank you so much for your reflections and insight. I appreciate the opportunity to listen in on this conversation. And she gave you a thumbs up. So,
Thank you, Jen.
we'll be, if you're new to the format, this Facebook Live video lives on in Facebook as a replay. I'll also upload it to my YouTube channel. But I appreciate people being here live, and I'll go back in and post some comments. Like I said, if you want some additional resources, just type in the word websites, and I'll put some of the URLs in that Sue's mentioned in our show. But we'll be back next Thursday at noon Mountain Time, and that will be our continuation of our topic on inclusion. And I just hope that you can share this video with friends and family, because I think you just experienced an awesome opportunity to hear some insights from a person that not only has been there as a parent, but is involved in the policy level decision making. And so I encourage you to share this video with your friends. And thank you once again, Sue. And we'll talk and figure out a time this summer where we can be back on and talk about the political side of education.
Perfect. Thanks so much.
All right, everybody, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.